I'm assuming if we start running a load cycle on this for the next couple months, it'll probably blow up. Lots of different times.
Did I make myself a huge mistake?
Are you tired of seeing this annoying activate Windows message? Then if so, today's video sponsor SCD Keys has you covered. For as little as $14 using the coupon code BFTYC, you can get activated today. Works for Windows 11 Pro too. Links in the description below.
Welcome back to Tech Yes City, and here we've got the Dell Aurora R12. Now I got this on an eBay Black Friday sale for 2,900 Aussie dollars. And when I saw the price, I was actually taken back because that's a little over 2,000 USD with a whole system with a 3080 Ti. Now, for you guys that aren't looking at graphics cards, basically the price that I paid for this whole system, you can buy at retail just the graphics card alone. So RTX 3080 Ti's in Australia are pretty much going for around 2,900 Aussie dollars. So the fact that we got a whole system with that graphics card included actually on the surface looks like it's one of the best deals of 2021. Though before buying this, I was really nervous because I watched the Gamers Nexus video on the Aurora R10 and I was very shocked at some of the things Dell tried to get away with in that build. The most important ones that I was paying attention to was the fact that the airflow at the back, there was just this little space that still exists on this Aurora R12. And even though this is the Intel version and there are a few different things, I have started pulling this apart and I will point out that there are some of those similar design flaws that do exist on this model. So besides the terrible inflow at the top of the PC, which is then covered by a power supply, which then covers your VRM and covers your RAM, they have tried to alleviate some of this problem by installing a 120mm water cooler on the CPU. So besides the RTX 3080 Ti being the biggest selling point of this PC, I'll run you guys through the rest of the specs. Here's where we've got an i5 11400F, 6 cores, 12 threads. We've also got a Z590 motherboard with onboard Wi-Fi 6, Bluetooth, and then they've got 16 gigabytes of RAM spread across two 8 gigabyte sticks at 3200 megahertz, with the ability, of course, if you want to upgrade it to 32 gigabytes or replace it and go up to 128 gigabytes. Though as for the rest of the specs, we got a 1000 watt power supply. Here's where Dell's actually done a very solid job. Fully modulated as well, so you can take it out with ease. It does look like it's a very high quality unit, 80 plus gold, and also the fact that you've got up to over 900 watts on the 12 volt line. So even for example, if you want to upgrade your CPU to an i9-11900K, add in more memory, more drives, you wouldn't have to worry at all at whether this power supply is good enough for the job, because it is more than good enough for anything that you could do with this system. Then the final component in the build is the 512 gigabyte NVMe SSD. Looks like a standard PCIe Gen 3. Though as you may notice here, we have pulled this system apart, and what we're doing is testing out the RTX 3080 Ti, which looks like it's Dell's own design for this graphics card. And looking at the temperatures on an open testbed system in a 28C ambient environment, this card actually is pretty solid. Needs two 8-pin connectors, which of course is all pre-connected in this build ready to go, but it's also got two 90mm fans that do a decent job of cooling out of the get-go. And also if you want to manually tune this, especially if you are into undervolting, then you can actually get so much more out of this graphics card. So that's pretty good to see that the most important component that most people would be buying this unit for is actually pretty solid. We've also done some 1080p and 4K benchmark numbers on the graphics card on a 12900K system, and then we're going to throw that graphics card back in this system and then run some tests and see if you are missing out or if you aren't missing out on a whole lot by staying with this pre-built Alienware Aurora R12. Now just finished a heap of different benchmarking on this system right here. And there's actually a lot of good news to report about the R12. And that is, for starters, the CPU temperature and the VRM temperature. Now, albeit it's an 11400F, an i5, so it's not a power-hungry CPU to begin with, but the motherboard did an okay job. When I was stress testing this on Cinebench R23, the maximum temperatures that we got on the CPU was 68 degrees, and this is in a 28 degree ambient environment. And then the most I saw on the motherboard when I quickly took the tray out after stress testing was about 52 degrees on the surface temperatures. So that was really, these scores are pretty decent. Now, it's nothing to really worry about at this level with the poor ventilation at the top. However, of course, if we started going into, say, an i7 or even an i9, for instance, an 11900K, which we will be looking at in a different video, that could spell a problem for the R12. But in its current form, if this was the unit you were buying, the CPU and the cooler on it and also the motherboard wouldn't be much of a concern. You wouldn't have to worry about it. Now there's also the GPU. This was a little bit more worrisome in the fact that I think this case design does let down the GPU temperatures, in that when we saw it on the open test bed, we were getting, in a 28 degree ambient environment, out of the box we've got 74 degrees at 60% fan speeds, auto. This was going up to 78 degrees in this case, and the fan speeds were going up to 66%. So it's not as good as an open test bed. Though I have seen cases, of course, some of the best cases for PC cooling that come through here are, of course, the ones that give you lower temperatures than an open air test bed. So this giving higher temperatures and also, of course, higher fan speeds on auto means that the case design isn't that good. So if it's anything, with Dell, I'd give them some feedback to improve the airflow, not only on the graphics card, where although they've got a 12 centimeter fan bringing air into it, and they've got side ventilation, it's still a 3080 Ti. So it is a power-hungry GPU, and it does need a good cooling solution, not just on the cooler itself for the GPU, but also its environment. So pretty much, all pun intended in this case, it's the opposite to what GN saw with their AMD R10. So those critiquing points aside, that is only one of two mediocre things with the R12, the Intel version. The second point is the BIOS as well. When we go into the BIOS, it's very basic, to the point where if you're an enthusiast, you're going to be surprised with the lack of options. You cannot really tune any voltages, any speeds, and you've only got the option to lock in XMP profiles. And also, if you've got a K CPU, you can then unlock a different tab. So there's not much you can do here in the way of tuning, but at the very least, they have given you the option to at least lock in those XMP profiles, where you're going to get a big uplift in performance as opposed to having it turned off. But all that considered, it's time to move on to some gaming benchmark numbers now, which is the most important part with a gaming PC. And here's where we tested against a 12900K system. And here's where we're going to throw in some bonus numbers on the undervolting as well as power consumption figures. So the first game we're going to pull up here is Borderlands 3. Here we've got 1080p numbers where they're virtually coming in the same league, where we've got this at ultra settings, and we saw on the 12900K DDR5 system. And this is where we're getting 154 average FPS versus 142 on the Aurora system. Then we move over to 4K, and we only got a difference of 1 average FPS. So there's really no difference if you're going to be playing at 4K ultra settings, which the 3080 Ti, as we can see from these FPS numbers, is perfectly capable of doing. Then move over to Age of Empires 4, my favorite PC game at the moment. Really good title, especially if you're into RTS. Here's where we got at 4K, 88 average FPS versus 86. So there wasn't really any difference that we had between going out and getting a really expensive CPU, motherboard, and DDR5 memory versus what the Aurora R12 is offering in its current form. However, stepping things down to 1080p, here's where we saw a sizable difference between the 12900K system and the 11400F system. So we're getting 155 average FPS versus 101. So pretty much over a 50% uplift going to the 12900K at 1080p. Then we go to Fortnite, the final game in today's comparison. Here was where we tested 1080p, low settings with epic view distance, the competitive pro settings, and we got here 469 on the 12900K system versus 293 on the Aurora R12 in its current form. Stepping things up to 4K, just like the other two titles we pulled up here, saw a similar trend of 79 average FPS versus 76. So you didn't lose much FPS at all by playing at 4K ultra settings. However, at 1080p in some titles, you will be losing some FPS, especially if you want to play competitively. So that's pretty much the difference between 11400F and a 12900K. However, there are some differences too when it comes to power consumption. And here's where this build at 4K in Borderlands 3, we decided to do power consumption tests between the different systems, and we got here a maximum of 524 watts on the Aurora R12 at 4K max settings. And then if we undervolted the GPU, we then stepped it down to 457 watts, whilst basically only losing 2 FPS. So we saw a big drop in power consumption. So if you want to undervolt, you're going to get better temperatures, you're also going to get better power consumption, and that's also going to be less heat in your case overall. So I really do recommend undervolting if you're on an RTX 3000 series graphics card. Also for AMD on their latest RX 6000 graphics cards too. They benefit greatly from this. Though contrasting that to the 12900K system, we did use up a little bit more power in this particular benchmark. That's of course because it is the latest and greatest, and it is a 5 gigahertz CPU, so it does run pretty high. In terms of this one right here, single core goes up to 4.4 gigahertz, multi-core goes up to 4.2 gigahertz across all those 6 cores, 12 threads. So with all those gaming benchmarks done and dusted, it's time to give you guys a clean-cut conclusion on the Aurora R12. And straight away, I'm gonna say, would I buy this again at 2,900 Aussie dollars? And the answer is overwhelmingly yes. This thing, for the money and what I paid for it, so it's a little over 2,000 USD, I'm getting a lot of computer and performance, especially at 4K for my money. And so what we said in the intro rings true. You're basically getting a whole computer, at least at the price I paid, for just the price of the graphics card. So I can't really complain in terms of the value, because the value this thing's bringing is actually pretty good. Though in a perfect world, if I was to change things with this build, the only thing I would really want to change would be the case. The airflow more specifically. Whereas we saw with that graphics card test, it was pretty bad. And then if we saw with that airflow covering the VRM on the motherboard, it was kind of like this sarcophagus that gets your motherboard and CPU and your RAM gets encased in. And that can be bad, especially over the long term. But the saving grace here is that the motherboard's VRM has a heatsink on it. It's got a pretty decent VRM, especially for 11400F, and the CPU isn't that power hungry. So you pretty much get away with it in this build. Though I don't know what happens in the upcoming video where we're going to change some components, because you're probably like, Brian, why did you buy an Aurora R12? And actually the reason I bought it is because I want to upgrade it and then try and flip it and make a profit. That's why I bought this thing. Because at 2,900 Aussie dollars, I can then add a CPU, flip the current CPU in it, and then also add 32 gigabytes of RAM and a 4 terabyte hard drive. And so off the top of my head, it's probably going to end up costing me an extra $350, and I'm then gonna have a 4 terabyte system, a 11900K i9, and also 32 gigabytes of RAM. So on the spec sheet, it's gonna look phenomenal. It's only gonna cost me around 3,300 Aussie dollars, and then I'm gonna hope it to flip it for over 4,000 Aussie dollars. So that's the real reason I bought it personally, but in the process, I wanna take you guys through a tour and say, hey, is this worth getting? And so the answer to that is, in its current form, yes, but it's not without problems. It's not a perfect PC, so if you've watched this review, you'll know that the airflow in the case isn't the best, and that's pretty much my only gripe with it. Everything else other than that does check out. And the RGB, at least on this PC, does look pretty cool. Though by default, the RGB is turned off, so you will have to go into the Alienware Command Center and turn it on. Though with all that aside, it was a completely different experience to what Gamers Nexus got with their Aurora R10. I think those guys, honestly, for the price they paid, like 1800 USD, I'd say they got hosed. Where the motherboard, the VRM, and the cooling solution in that particular build was just absolutely horrible. This thing, however, is a much better solution where I didn't come into any thermal throttling, and overall it should do a good job even in the long term. Anyway guys, hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, then be sure to drop a comment in the comment section below. Let us know what you think of the Alienware Aurora R12. Honestly, I'm surprised that it was this cheap, because usually the Dell Alienware stuff carries a pretty hefty premium. I'm actually surprised that it came up at the price that it did. But overall, I mean, Dell can improve on some things, and I think if they did, they'd have an absolute winner on their hands. I think the aesthetics, however, is a pretty cool point about the Alienware stuff. So do let us know what you think in the comments section below, just like this question of the day here, which comes from Dartmaster300, and they ask, how many languages can you speak up, bro? And so in the recent live stream, I was speaking a bit of Japanese, and I only speak English and Japanese, and that's because I lived in Japan for quite a while. In terms of learning other languages, it's actually really hard. I struggle learning languages. The only way I learned Japanese wasn't by studying, it was just going out and constantly speaking to people. I'm actually kind of pretty bad at learning a language via pen and paper. So hopefully that answers that question, and I'll catch you guys in another tech video very soon. If you stayed this far and you're enjoying that Tech Yes content, be sure to hit that sub button, ring that bell. Hope you guys also have a Merry Christmas wherever you guys are in the world. And also, if you want some behind the scenes footage, you can also hit the join button. For as little as $1 a month, you get the behind the scenes Tech Yes videos. And I'll catch you in the next one. Peace out for now. Bye.